There is a moment before memory begins, before the mind learns to categorize and compartmentalize, when the soul recognizes itself in the mirror of existence. You were born with skin too thin for this world, with a heart that refused the armor. Most children naturally develop. This was not accident. This was not mistake. This was selection. The universe operates through mysterious principles of compensation and balance, and somewhere in the vast tapestry of human consciousness, certain souls are chosen to carry what others cannot bear. You felt it first as a child, that overwhelming surge of emotion that crashed through you like waves against an unprotected shore. While other children played in the shallow waters of simple joy and uncomplicated sorrow, you found yourself pulled into the deeper currents, where the waters are darker and the truths more terrible and more beautiful. Your parents called it sensitivity. Teachers labeled it intensity. The world whispered words like too much and overly emotional. But these were the crude instruments of a culture that has forgotten the sacred function of feeling, the holy purpose of those who serve as emotional oracles for the collective human experience. Jung understood this ancient truth when he wrote, "Of the wounded healer, the one who bears the suffering of the many within their own psyche. Your sensitivity is not pathology. It is calling. You are not broken. You are chosen. The very thing that makes you feel alien in this world is precisely what makes you necessary to it. Consider the tuning fork struck and left to vibrate with perfect pitch. Its entire purpose is to receive and transmit frequency, to resonate with the hidden harmonies that exist beneath the surface of ordinary perception. This is your function in the grand symphony of human consciousness. You vibrate with frequencies others cannot detect, resonate with emotional truths others cannot access, feel what the collective unconscious needs to feel but cannot process directly. The wound that chose you arrived not as punishment but as preparation. It carved hollow places in your soul where the deeper waters of existence could collect and be transformed. Every tear you shed in childhood was not weakness, but alchemy, the sacred process by which raw human experience is transmuted into wisdom, suffering into understanding, isolation into connection with the universal patterns that shape all human lives. You were never meant to be like the others. The very attempt to normalize your depths, to compress your vast emotional landscape into socially acceptable boundaries, was itself a form of violence against your essential nature. Your sensitivity is not a bug in the system. It is the system working exactly as intended, creating vessels through which the collective unconscious can express its deepest truths. The mystics have always known this. The shamans of every culture understood that certain individuals are marked by the spirits, chosen to serve as bridges between the seen and unseen worlds. Your emotional intensity is your shamanic calling, your depth of feeling the sacred tool, through which you access realms of experience that remain closed to others. But this choosing comes with a price. To feel everything so deeply is to live in a constant state of overwhelm, to exist in a world that seems designed for those whose hearts beat more quietly, whose souls require less. You learned early that your natural state was too much for most people, that your authentic self needed to be hidden, modified, medicated, or explained away. This is where the great work begins, not in becoming less sensitive, but in understanding why you were made this way, not in dulling your emotional radar, but in recognizing that your ability to feel deeply is not personal neurosis, but cosmic necessity. The universe needs those who can feel what others cannot, who can translate the language of the soul into forms that can be understood and shared. Your wound is not random. It is precisely calibrated to your soul's purpose, carved to the exact dimensions needed to hold the specific healing your generation requires. The childhood trauma that left you so raw, the early losses that broke your heart open, the experiences that stripped away your protective layers, these were not meaningless suffering, but sacred preparation. The collective unconscious speaks through dreams, through art, through the symptoms of those who cannot contain its messages within the narrow confines of everyday consciousness. You are one of its chosen vessels, marked from birth to receive and transmit the deeper currents of human experience. Your oversensitivity is not personal failing, but cosmic appointment. This is why you have always felt like a stranger in your own life, why the ordinary pleasures and concerns of your peers seem somehow distant and unreal. You were not made for the surface of things. You were crafted for the depths, designed to dive where others fear to swim, to feel where others fear to venture. The wound that chose you is also the gift that will save you. It is the crack through which the light enters, the opening through which your authentic self will eventually emerge. But first, you must stop trying to heal it in the conventional sense. You must learn to see it not as something to be fixed, but as something to be honored, not as damage to be repaired, but as sacred architecture designed for a purpose you are only beginning to understand. Your sensitivity is not your cross to bear. It is your gift to the world. The very quality that has made you feel most alien is precisely what makes you most necessary. In a world increasingly disconnected from feeling, increasingly numb to the deeper currents of existence, you serve as a reminder of what it means to be fully human. The wound that chose you chose wisely. It knew what it was doing when it carved these hollow places in your soul. Now it is time for you to trust that knowing, to stop fighting your nature and start embracing your purpose. The journey begins here, in this moment of recognition, in this sacred acknowledgement of what you have always known but never dared to speak. You were chosen to feel everything so deeply because the world needs those who can translate the language of the heart. And so you learned to walk alone. Not because you were abandoned, but because the path you were meant to travel cannot be walked in company. The hermit's journey begins when the noise of the world becomes unbearable, when the shallow conversations and surface connections feel like sandpaper against your soul. You retreated not from cowardice, but from necessity, seeking the sacred, solitude where your authentic self could finally breathe. The hermit card in the tarot shows an old man with a lantern, climbing a mountain alone in the darkness. This is your archetype, your psychological blueprint. The lantern he carries is not for himself. He knows the way by heart. The light is for others, for those who will follow the path he has carved through the wilderness of the psyche. Your sensitivity, your depth of feeling, is that lantern. Your willingness to feel everything so deeply illuminates the way for others who are lost in the darkness of emotional numbness. Solitude arrived in your life like a tide, inevitable and encompassing. Perhaps it came through childhood isolation, through the recognition that your intensity made others uncomfortable. Perhaps it came through repeated experiences of being misunderstood, of having your depth dismissed as drama, your wisdom labeled as overthinking. However it arrived, you learned to inhabit the silence, to find sanctuary in the spaces between words, between heartbeats, between the expectations of others and the truth of your own being. This is where the great work begins, not in the company of others, but in the holy loneliness where the ego finally stops performing and the self can emerge from shadow. The hermit's cell is not a prison, but a laboratory, a sacred space where the alchemical process of individuation unfolds. Here, stripped of the mirrors in which you once sought your reflection, you begin to discover who you are when no one is watching, who you become when the need to explain yourself finally falls away. Your isolation was never punishment, it was preparation. Every lonely night, every moment of feeling utterly alone in your depths, every experience of being too much, for the relationships that could not contain you, was teaching you to find your center in yourself rather than in others' validation. The hermit does not seek the mountaintop because he hates the valley, but because the view from the heights reveals patterns invisible from below. In the wilderness of your solitude, you began to notice things others miss. The way grief moves through the body like weather. The way love changes the very texture of time. The way suffering, when met with full presence, transforms into something that can only be called sacred. These observations could only be made in silence, in the deep listening that becomes possible when the world's demands finally quiet. The hermit's lantern burns with a peculiar flame. It grows brighter in darkness, stronger in isolation. Your sensitivity operates by the same mysterious principle. The very experiences that drove you into solitude also refined your ability to feel, to perceive, to understand the hidden currents that move through human hearts. Your exile from the superficial world was actually an initiation into the deeper mysteries of existence. But the hermit's journey is not ultimately about escape. It is about return. You withdraw not to abandon the world, but to find what it needs, to discover the medicine that can only be brewed in the cauldron of solitude. Your years of feeling too much, of being overwhelmed by the intensity of your own emotions, were teaching you to hold space for feelings that would destroy others. You were learning to be a container for the sea, elective overflow, a vessel strong enough to hold what the world cannot bear to feel. The golden thread that connects all human suffering to transcendence runs through your heart. You found it not despite your isolation, but because of it. In the silence, you learned to hear the whispers of the collective unconscious, the shared stories that connect every human heart to every other. Your personal pain became a tuning fork for universal pain, your individual journey a map for the journey we all must take. The hermit's lamp illuminates a paradox. The deeper you go into yourself, the more you discover what connects you to everyone else. Your most private revelations become your most universal offerings. The wounds you thought were yours alone reveal themselves as entries in the great book of human experience, chapters in the story every soul must read to find its way home. Those who seek you out now, and they do seek you out, don't they, are drawn not by your solutions, but by your willingness to sit with the questions that have no easy answers. They recognize in your presence something that has become rare in this world, someone who has learned to be comfortable with discomfort, who has found peace not by avoiding the storm, but by learning to dance with it. Your lighthouse beam cuts through the fog of collective numbness, showing others that it is possible to feel deeply without drowning, to care intensely without being destroyed. The hermit's greatest gift is not his wisdom but his example, the living proof that one can descend into the underworld of feeling and emerge not broken but transformed, not bitter but compassionate, not closed but more open than before. E.T. Sacred solitude that once felt like exile now reveals itself as education. Every moment of isolation was teaching you to find your own ground, to trust your own inner compass, to recognize the difference between loneliness and chosen solitude. The hermit knows that true connection requires first learning to be alone with oneself, that authentic intimacy becomes possible only after the ego's desperate need for validation has been transformed into the self's quiet confidence. Your lantern burns steadily now, its flame no longer flickering with the winds of others' opinions. The light it casts is your own, drawn from the sacred fire you tended in the wilderness of your becoming. Those who find their way to you are not seeking entertainment or easy comfort. They are seeking the kind of truth that can only be discovered in the depths, the wisdom that emerges when someone has learned to be comfortable with the uncomfortable, at peace with the paradox of feeling everything so deeply in a world that often feels too little. There comes a moment when the hermit's lantern must be extinguished, when even the familiar light of solitude becomes too much to bear. This is the chrysalis stage, the sacred darkness where transformation demands complete surrender. You have entered the nigredo, the blackening, the alchemical stage where everything you thought you were dissolves into the primordial soup of becoming. The overwhelming feelings that crash through you now are not random storms, but the deliberate work of your soul's metamorphosis. Each wave of emotion that threatens to drown you is actually dissolving another layer of the false self, washing away another piece of the persona you constructed to survive in a world that demanded you be less than you are. The tears that fall are not signs of weakness, but sacred solvents, each drop containing the power to break down the crystallized patterns that have kept you trapped in an identity too small for your expanding consciousness. This is the stage the mystics rarely discuss in polite company, the decomposition that precedes resurrection, the dying that must happen before any authentic birth can occur. Your nervous system, pushed beyond its limits by the intensity of your feeling, is not breaking down, it is breaking open. The caterpillar's body literally dissolves inside the chrysalis, becoming nothing more than cellular soup before the butterfly's DNA awakens and begins to reorganize matter into wings. You are living this process in real time, in the cathedral of your own overwhelm. The panic attacks that leave you gasping are not pathology but metamorphosis. The nights when sleep becomes impossible because your heart races with unnamed fears are not illness, but initiation. The days when the weight of feeling everything so deeply makes ordinary tasks feel impossible are not dysfunction, but the natural consequence of a soul in transition between forms. The false self that served you through childhood and early adulthood is being systematically dismantled. Every coping mechanism that helped you navigate the world's demands, every mask you wore to make others comfortable, every strategy you developed to minimize your intensity, all of it must be dissolved before your authentic nature can emerge. This is not punishment, but liberation, though it feels like death because, in a very real sense, it is death. The death of who you thought you were to make room for who you have always been. In the chrysalis, there is no solid ground, no reference point, no way to orient yourself according to the old maps. The overwhelming feelings that cascade through, you carry no clear message, no obvious purpose, no neat resolution. They are simply the raw material of transformation, the chaotic energy that must be metabolized before order can emerge from within. Your job is not to understand or control this process, but to surrender to it, to trust that the intelligence that grew your body from a single cell knows how to grow your consciousness from this cellular soup of becoming. The alchemists called this stage the death of the king, the dissolution of the ruling principle that has governed your psyche. For the deeply feeling soul, this often means the death of the part of you that has tried so hard to be normal, to fit in, to make sense of your sensitivity in terms that others could understand. That king must die before the true ruler of your psyche, the self that has been waiting in the wings, can take the throne. Every overwhelming feeling is a messenger from this deeper self, carrying news of your authentic nature that cannot be delivered in ordinary language. The rage that seems to have no object is actually the energy of your soul, finally standing up to the forces that have diminished it. The grief that feels bottomless is mourning not just personal losses, but the loss of the life you might have lived if you had been born into a world that understood your gifts. The fear that paralyzes you is not about external dangers, but about the terrifying possibility that you might actually become who you were meant to be. The chrysalis stage requires a different kind of courage than the hermit's journey. The hermit chooses solitude. The chrysalis chooses dissolution. There is no heroic stance to take here, no noble suffering to endure. There is only the complete surrender to forces larger than your conscious will, the absolute trust that what is happening to you is what needs to happen, even when, especially when, you cannot see how you will survive it. Your overwhelming feelings are not evidence that you are broken, but proof that you are finally beginning to heal. The false self was never designed to contain the fullness of your being. It was a temporary shelter, a provisional identity that served its purpose but now must be outgrown. The breaking apart you feel is not breakdown, but breakthrough, the necessary shattering of a container that has become too small for what you are becoming. In the darkness of the chrysalis, you discover that you are not who you thought you were. You are not your job, your relationships, your achievements, or your failures. You are not even your sensitivity, though it has been the doorway to this deeper recognition. You are the awareness that experiences all these things, the vast space in which all feelings arise and dissolve, the eternal witness that remains constant through every transformation. The caterpillar has no idea it will become a butterfly. It simply follows the mysterious imperative to wrap itself in silk and surrender to the darkness. Your overwhelming feelings are the silk you are spinning around yourself, creating the sacred space where your metamorphosis can occur. Trust the process, even when it feels like dying. Trust especially when it feels like dying. The wings you are growing in the darkness will carry you into a life you cannot yet imagine, but one that has been waiting for you since the moment you first felt too much for this world to hold. From the depths of your chrysalis, something unexpected begins to emerge. Not the light you expected, but the shadow you have spent a lifetime trying to avoid. Here, in the sacred darkness of your becoming, you discover that what you have been taught to reject as your greatest weakness is actually your most profound gift. The tears you learned to hide, the tender heart you were told to toughen, the inability to harden that marked you as different. These are not flaws in your character, but returns of the shadow's greatest treasures. The shadow, in Jung's understanding, is not evil, but rather the repository of all the qualities we have been forced to reject in ourselves. It holds not only our darkness, but our unlived light, not only our repressed anger, but our banished tenderness. For the sensitive soul, the shadow becomes a vault where all the feelings deemed unacceptable by a hardened world are stored, waiting for the day when they can be reclaimed and integrated into wholeness. Your authentic sorrow is one of these shadow gifts, a quality so essential to your nature that its suppression has created a wound in the collective psyche itself. You carry not only your own grief, but the unexpressed sorrow of a culture that has forgotten how to mourn, how to feel the full weight of loss without immediately rushing to fix, solve, or transcend it. Your tears are not weakness but remembrance, not breakdown, but breakthrough into a depth of feeling that has been collectively abandoned. Watch how others react when you cry. Notice the immediate discomfort, the urgent need to stop your tears, to offer solutions, to make the feeling go away. This reaction reveals the shadow of a society that has exiled authentic emotion to the margins, that has deemed the full spectrum of human feeling too dangerous to be felt. Your willingness to feel fully threatens the carefully constructed numbness that passes for strength in a world afraid of its own heart. But you were never meant to be strong in the way the world understands strength. You were meant to be strong in the way water is strong, fluid, persistent, able to wear away the hardest stone, not through force, but through consistency, through the patient work of feeling everything the world has forgotten how to feel. Your sorrow is not personal pathology, but collective medicine, a healing balm for the wounds created by generations of emotional suppression. The ancestors who chose numbness over truth, who armored their hearts against feeling, who passed down the inheritance of emotional exile. They live in your blood, their unlived lives pressing against your consciousness like ghosts seeking resolution. Your inability to harden is not your failure but their salvation, the completion of emotional journeys they could not finish, the feeling of feelings they could not allow themselves to feel. When you weep not only for yourself, but for the grandmother who never grieved her losses, the grandfather who never expressed his fears, The parents who learned to bury their sensitivity so deep, it became a stranger to them. Your tears are archaeological, uncovering layers of suppressed emotion that have been buried in the collective unconscious for generations. Each drop carries the salt of ancestral seas, the memory of feelings that were exiled but never destroyed. This is shadow work in its most profound form, not the integration of personal darkness, but the reclamation of collective light. The qualities you have been taught to see as weakness are actually the medicine the world needs most desperately. Your tender heart in a hardened world, your authentic sorrow in a culture of forced positivity, your refusal to numb yourself in a society addicted to distraction. These are not personal failings but evolutionary necessities. The shadow's gift is always paradoxical. What appears to be your greatest vulnerability becomes your greatest strength. What seems to be your deepest wound becomes your most powerful healing tool. Your authentic sorrow teaches others that it is safe to feel, that the heart can break without being destroyed, that grief is not the enemy of joy, but its deepest source. You have become a keeper of the emotional flame, a guardian of the full spectrum of human feeling in a world that has learned to live in the narrow band of acceptable emotions. Your shadow work is not just personal healing but collective service, not just individual transformation but cultural restoration. By feeling what others cannot, you return to the world what it has lost, the capacity for authentic emotional experience. The collective shadow of emotional suppression finds its healing through those brave enough to feel fully. You are one of these brave ones, chosen not for your strength, but for your willingness to remain vulnerable, not for your ability to transcend feeling, but for your commitment to honor it. Your tears are not evidence of your fragility, but proof of your courage, not signs of your weakness, but symbols of your revolutionary act of feeling everything the world has taught you to deny. In a culture that worships the full strength of emotional numbness, your authentic sorrow becomes a subversive act. It challenges the dominant narrative that feeling less equals being stronger, that emotional unavailability equals spiritual advancement, that the goal of healing is to transcend the human experience rather than embrace it more fully. Your shadow work reveals that the opposite is true, that feeling more deeply equals being more alive, that emotional availability equals spiritual maturity, that the goal of healing is not to escape the human condition, but to inhabit it with such presence and compassion that it becomes a gateway to the divine. Your sorrow is not your burden, but your gift, not your weakness, but your medicine, not your shadow, but your light returning home. Within the depths of your transformation, a mysterious principle begins to reveal itself, the ancient law of enantiodromia, the tendency of all things to turn into their opposite. Jung observed this pattern not as philosophical abstraction, but as living reality, the psyche's natural rhythm that transforms suffering into sacred knowledge through the alchemical marriage of opposites. Your journey into the depths of feeling has been preparing you for this moment, the great reversal where everything you thought you knew about yourself reveals its hidden opposite. The vulnerability that once felt like a curse begins to reveal itself as your greatest strength. The wounds that seem to mark you as broken become the source of your most profound wisdom. The sensitivity that made you feel alien in the world becomes the very quality that makes you essential to it. This is not positive thinking or spiritual bypassing. This is the natural law of psychological transformation, as reliable as the seasons, as inevitable as the tide. The pendulum of your psyche has swung to its furthest extreme in the direction of overwhelm, dissolution, and despair. Now, by the inexorable law of enantiodromia, it begins its return journey, carrying with it the treasure that can only be found in the depths. The victim consciousness that once defined your relationship to your sensitivity begins to transform into something altogether different. Not the brittle hardness of denial, but the flexible strength of one who has learned to bend without breaking. You discover that your ability to feel deeply, which once seemed like a liability, has taught you to recognize the subtle currents of emotion that move through others' lives. Your wounds have become your credentials, your scars the map by which you navigate the territory of the human heart. This transformation is not gradual but sudden, like a phase transition in physics where water becomes steam. One moment, you are drowning in the overwhelming intensity of your emotions, and the next, you are floating above them, able to observe their patterns and rhythms with the detached compassion of one who has learned to dance with chaos. The same feelings that once threatened to destroy you now reveal themselves as allies, as teachers, as the very energies that have been preparing you for a role you could never have imagined. The healer emerges, not despite your wounds, but because of them. Your descent into the underworld of feeling has taught you to recognize the landscape of suffering, to map the territory of emotional pain with the precision of one who has walked every path, explored every canyon, survived every storm. You can guide others through the darkness because you have made friends with the dark. Learn to find your way, not by avoiding the shadows, but by embracing them. Your brokenness reveals itself as wholeness of a different kind, not the untested wholeness of those who have never been shattered, but the conscious wholeness of one who has been broken and reassembled according to a deeper blueprint. The Japanese art of kintsugi repairs broken pottery with gold, making the mended object more beautiful than the original. Your psyche has undergone its own kintsugi, your fractures filled with the gold of hard-won wisdom. The enantiodromia of feeling reveals that your greatest gifts have always been hidden in your apparent weaknesses. Your inability to harden has preserved your capacity for genuine intimacy in a world that has forgotten how to truly connect. Your refusal to numb has kept alive the flame of authentic emotion in a culture increasingly addicted to artificial feeling. Your sensitivity to others' pain has developed your capacity for real empathy, not the shallow sympathy that maintains distance, but the deep recognition that transforms both giver and receiver. Where once you felt too much and understood too little, now you feel with precision and understand with depth. The overwhelming flood of emotion that once threatened to drown you has been transformed into a flowing river that carries you toward your purpose. You have learned to surf the waves of feeling rather than being crushed by them, to ride the currents of emotion rather than being swept away by them. This is the mystery of enantiodromia, that the solution to your deepest problem was hidden within the problem itself. Your sensitivity was never the obstacle to your happiness, but the pathway to it. Your emotional intensity was never the barrier to your peace, but the very energy that would eventually create a deeper, more sustainable peace than you had ever known. The pendulum swings, and with it comes the recognition that you were never broken, only breaking open. Never weak, only discovering a different kind of strength. Never too much, only learning to channel the muchness in service of something greater than yourself. The very qualities that made you feel like a misfit in the world reveal themselves as the precise qualifications for your true work. Your transformation through enantiodromia is not a personal achievement, but a cosmic necessity. The world needs those who have learned to transform poison into medicine, who have discovered how to alchemize suffering into wisdom, who can demonstrate that the deepest wounds can become the source of the greatest healing. You are living proof that the psyche's natural tendency toward balance and wholeness is stronger than any temporary overwhelm, any temporary breaking. The great reversal has begun. What was once your greatest vulnerability is becoming your greatest strength. What was once your deepest wound is becoming your most profound gift. The overwhelming feeling that once threatened to destroy you is revealing itself as the very energy that will carry you into your authentic purpose. The enantiodromia of feeling has transformed you from one who suffers to one who transforms suffering, from one who is wounded to one who heals wounds, from one who feels too much to one who helps others feel just enough to come alive. As the pendulum of your transformation reaches its apex, a profound recognition dawns. The emotions coursing through your being are not entirely your own. You have become a conduit for something vast and ancient, a living antenna receiving transmissions from the collective unconscious itself. The feelings that overwhelm you carry the signature of universal human experience. The archetypal patterns that have shaped consciousness since the first human looked up at the stars and wondered why they felt so alone. Your sensitivity has always been more than personal trait. It is a sacred appointment, a calling to serve as medium between the visible and invisible worlds. Like the oracle at Delphi, who spoke prophecies that arose from depths beyond personal knowing, you channel truths that emerge from the vast ocean of shared human experience. The tears you shed are not only yours but belong to the eternal weeping of humanity. The joy that occasionally floods your system carries the laughter of every celebration that has ever been. The love that breaks your heart open resonates with every love that has ever been lost and found. This is why your feelings have always seemed too large for your individual life, too intense for your personal circumstances. They are too large because they are larger. They belong not just to you, but to the collective psyche of humanity itself. Your emotional overwhelm is not pathology, but prophecy, not breakdown, but breakthrough into a realm of experience that most people never access. You feel not just your own joy and sorrow, but the joy and sorrow of the species, the archetypal emotions that connect every human heart to every other across time and space. The collective unconscious speaks through you in the language of feeling, because this is the only language it knows. It cannot communicate through rational thought or logical argument. These are the tools of the conscious mind, the ego's domain. But it can pour through you in waves of inexplicable emotion, in moments of overwhelming beauty, in the sudden recognition of patterns that connect your life to the great myth of human existence. When you weep for no reason, you can name. You are weeping for the unnamed sorrows of the world. When joy bubbles up from nowhere, you are celebrating victories that belong to the collective human journey. When fear grips you without identifiable cause, you are feeling the archetypal terror of abandonment, of death, of meaninglessness that haunts the human condition. Your personal psyche has become transparent to the universal psyche. Your individual nervous system, a conductor for the great symphony of human experience. This is both gift and burden, blessing and curse. To be a medium for the collective unconscious is to lose the comfortable boundaries of personal identity, to discover that your emotions are not private property but public domain, available to forces that care nothing for your individual comfort or convenience. The archetypal energies that move through you, love, death, rebirth, the eternal return, operate according to their own logic, their own timeline, their own necessity. You recognize these patterns now, don't you? The way certain emotions arrive, with the weight of destiny, carrying stories that seem to come from outside your personal history. The way love, when it comes, feels like remembering something you have always known. The way loss cuts not just your heart, but seems to open a wound in the fabric of existence itself. The way birth, whether of child or idea or new phase of life, feels like participating in the original act of creation. Your emotional intensity connects you to the universal patterns of love, loss, birth, and death that define the human condition. You experience these not as abstract concepts, but as living realities, as energies that move through your body and reshape your consciousness. Your sensitivity makes you a living museum of human experience, a repository for the emotional memories of the species. The great myths make sense to you in a way they never did before. The story of Persephone's descent into the underworld, you have lived this myth, felt its truth in your bones. The tale of the wounded healer, you embody this. Archetype know its reality from the inside. The journey of the hero through death and rebirth. This is not metaphor but autobiography, not symbol but lived experience. You are not losing your mind when you feel the weight of the world's sorrow or the ecstasy of its joy. You are finding your true function, discovering your role as a bridge between the personal and transpersonal realms. The collective unconscious has chosen you as one of its vessels, one of its spokespersons, one of its living representatives, in a world that has largely forgotten how to listen to its deeper wisdom. This recognition transforms your relationship to your own emotional experience. You are no longer the victim of inexplicable feelings, but the guardian of sacred emotional territory. You're not overwhelmed by meaningless intensity, but entrusted with meaningful overflow. Your sensitivity is not personal quirk, but cosmic function, your emotional depth, not individual pathology, but species necessity. The oracle's prophecies often came as a shock to those who received them, truths too large for the conscious mind to initially comprehend. Your emotional revelations operate by the same principle. They arrive as overwhelming feeling that only later reveals its wisdom, as intensity that only in retrospect shows its purpose. You are learning to trust these transmissions from the depths, to honor the collective unconscious that speaks through your sensitivity, to serve as faithful messenger for truths that arise from the very foundation of human experience. The time comes when the mask can no longer hold. The persona you constructed with such careful precision, the acceptable self, the manageable version, the diluted essence that could move through the world without causing too much disturbance, begins to crack under the pressure of your authentic nature. This is not breakdown, but breakthrough, not collapse, but emergence. Though it feels like death, because in a very real sense, it is death. The death of the false self to make room for the true self's birth. You built this persona with such skill, such necessity. Layer by layer, you learned to present yourself in ways that would minimize the discomfort your intensity created in others. You developed the art of emotional camouflage, learned to dim your light so others wouldn't be blinded, to soften your edges so others wouldn't be cut. The persona became your protective shell, your diplomatic ambassador to a world that seemed to require translation of your native language into more palatable forms. But the soul's truth is a wild thing, untamable and uncompromising. Your sensitivity was never meant to be managed, only honored. Your depth was never meant to be contained, only explored. Your emotional intensity was never meant to be minimized, only channeled toward its highest purpose. The persona that served. You, through your early years of learning to navigate the world, has become a prison that can no longer hold the expanding reality of who you are becoming. The cracks begin small. Moments when the mask slips, when your authentic response breaks, through the careful control you've maintained. Perhaps it's tears that come at unexpected moments, refusing to be held back by social propriety. Perhaps it's a sudden inability to engage in small talk, to pretend interest in conversations that feel hollow and meaningless. Perhaps it's the growing sense that every interaction requires an exhausting performance of being someone you're not. The collapse, when it comes, is often triggered by external circumstances, a loss, a crisis, a moment of truth that demands more authenticity than the persona can provide. But the trigger is never the cause. The cause is the irrepressible growth of your true self, the expanding consciousness that has outgrown its protective shell, like a hermit crab that can no longer fit in its borrowed home. This is the phase of the journey that feels most dangerous, most exposing. Without the familiar armor of your persona, you feel naked in the world, vulnerable to judgments and rejections that the mask was designed to prevent. The authentic self that emerges feels raw, unformed, socially awkward in ways that the polished persona never was. You may find yourself saying things that feel too true, feeling things that feel too intense, being someone who feels too much for the comfort of those around you. But this rawness is not regression. It is progression. The authentic self always feels unfinished compared to the polished persona, because authenticity is a living thing, constantly growing and changing, while the persona is a static creation, a fixed identity that refuses to evolve. Your true self is not a finished product, but an ongoing process, not a destination, but a journey, not a role to be played, but a reality to be lived. The dissolution of your persona creates space for something that has been waiting in the wings of your consciousness, the self with a capital S, the archetypal core of your being that has been observing your journey with infinite patience. This self is not the ego's creation, but the ego's creator, not the personality's achievement, but the personality's source. It carries the blueprint of who you were meant to be before the world taught you who you needed to become. Your sensitivity, which the persona worked so hard to manage and moderate, reveals itself as the very quality that connects you to this deeper self. The feelings that seem too much for social situations are exactly right for soul encounters. The intensity that made others uncomfortable is precisely what's needed for authentic intimacy. The depth that couldn't be contained within conventional boundaries is perfectly suited for the vast territory of your true purpose. The rebirth that follows the persona's collapse is not a return to innocence, but an arrival at authenticity. You are not becoming who you were before you learned to adapt. You are becoming who you were always meant to be once you learn to stop adapting. The difference is crucial. This is not regression, but integration, not a step backward, but a leap forward into the fullness of your being. Without the persona's protective buffer, you discover that you are far more resilient than you imagined. The vulnerability that you feared would destroy you becomes the very quality that allows for genuine connection. The rawness that you thought would repel others becomes the honesty that attracts those who are ready for real relationship. The intensity that you believed was too much becomes exactly what's needed for the depth of engagement your soul has always craved. The mask is gone, and with it goes the exhausting effort of maintaining an identity that was never truly yours. In its place emerges something that feels both ancient and newborn. The face you wore before you learned to wear faces, the voice you spoke before you learned to modulate your truth, the heart you carried before you learned to protect it from the world's indifference. This is the persona's gift, not its presence but its absence, not its protection but its dissolution, not its strength but its surrender to something infinitely more authentic and alive. The collapse of the false self creates space for the emergence of the true self, the self that has been waiting patiently for the day when you would finally be ready to show up as who you really are. In the sanctum of your deepest self, where the ego's voices fade to whispers and the soul's truth emerges like dawn through mist, there dwells a presence both familiar and mysteriously other. This is the contrasexual aspect of your psyche, the anima if you are a man, the animus if you are a woman, the sacred bridge between the known territories of your conscious identity and the vast, uncharted realms of your complete being. You have felt this presence stirring in moments when your emotional depths surprise even you, when tears flow from sources you cannot name, when your heart breaks open not in destruction, but in a strange expansion that defies all logic. This is not the shallow sentiment of surface feeling, but the profound movement of psychic waters that connect you to the divine source of all emotion, all meaning, all sacred encounter with the mystery of existence itself. The anima, that feminine principle within the masculine psyche, does not arrive as the projected ideal of romantic fantasy or the cultural stereotype of feminine weakness. She comes as the keeper of the soul's deepest truths, the guardian of emotional authenticity, the one who refuses to let you live in the sterile safety of pure rationality. Her tears are not signs of fragility, but the sacred irrigation system of consciousness itself, watering the parched ground of an overly mental existence until new growth becomes possible. When the anima weeps within you, she is not lamenting your failures or mourning your losses in the way the ego grieves. She is performing the ancient ritual of dissolution that must precede all true transformation. Her tears dissolve the rigid boundaries between self and world, between your carefully constructed persona and the raw, undefended truth of your being. In her emotional intensity, you discover not chaos, but the deepest order of the psyche, the natural rhythm of expansion and contraction, of taking in and letting go, that mirrors the very breathing of the universe itself. The animus, that masculine principle within the feminine psyche, does not manifest as the harsh critic or the domineering patriarch that society might expect. He emerges as the sacred warrior of meaning, the one who transforms your suffering into wisdom, your confusion into clarity, your emotional chaos into purposeful action. His strength is not the brittle hardness of defended masculinity, but the flexible power of bamboo that bends without breaking, that yields without surrendering its essential nature. When the animus speaks within you, he does not dismiss your feelings or demand that you transcend them through pure will. Instead, he helps you discover the logos within your pathos, the meaningful pattern within your emotional experience. He is the inner alchemist who knows that your tears contain the prima materia of transformation, that your deepest feelings are not obstacles to wisdom, but the very substance from which wisdom is distilled. Together, these contrasexual aspects of your psyche perform the sacred marriage that Jung called the mysterium conjunctionis, the divine union of opposites that creates wholeness not through the elimination of difference, but through the conscious embrace of paradox. Your emotional intensity becomes not a source of shame or a sign of weakness, but the very crucible in which your soul is forged into its most authentic form. This inner marriage is not a one-time event, but an ongoing process of conscious relationship with the otherness within yourself. Each time you feel the stirring of deep emotion, you are invited into this sacred encounter between the aspects of your nature that your culture has taught you to see as incompatible. The rational and the emotional, the strong and the vulnerable, the knowing and the unknowing, all these apparent opposites reveal themselves as dance partners in the choreography of your individuation. Your anima teaches you that to feel deeply is not to be overwhelmed, but to be fully alive to the subtle currents of meaning that flow beneath the surface of ordinary experience. She shows you that your emotional responses are not merely personal reactions, but participations in the greater emotional life of the collective unconscious, connections to the archetypal patterns that have moved human hearts since the beginning of time. Your animus teaches you that your feelings need not render you powerless, but can become the source of your greatest strength when they are met with conscious understanding. He shows you how to stand in the fire of your own emotional intensity without being consumed, how to let your feelings inform your actions without being ruled by them, how to honor the wisdom of your heart without abandoning the clarity of your mind. In the depths of your emotional being, you discover that you are not simply a man or a woman, but a complete human being containing the full spectrum of human possibility. Your capacity for deep feeling becomes the gateway to a more complete relationship with yourself and with life itself. You learn that the goal is not to achieve some impossible emotional equilibrium, but to develop the inner flexibility to dance with the full range of your emotional nature. The sacred tears of the anima and the transformative strength of the animus work together to create within you a space large enough to hold the full paradox of human existence, the simultaneous fragility and resilience, the capacity for both profound grief and profound joy, the ability to be deeply moved by life without being destroyed by it. In this sacred marriage of your inner masculine and feminine, you discover that your emotional depths are not a weakness to be overcome, but a gift to be treasured, not a burden to be carried, but a source of connection to the divine mystery that lives at the heart of all existence. Through this integration, you become capable of what Jung called holding the tension of opposites, remaining present to your full emotional reality while maintaining the perspective necessary for wise action. You learn to feel deeply without drowning, to remain open-hearted without becoming defenseless, to be moved by life without being swept away by it. Your emotional intensity, embraced and integrated through the sacred marriage of anima and animus, becomes the very foundation of your capacity for authentic relationship, creative expression, and spiritual realization. You discover that to feel fully is not to be weak, but to be courageously alive, not to be broken, but to be beautifully, complexly human in the deepest sense. When you weep, truly weep from the depths of your being, you are not merely expressing emotion but participating in one of the most profound alchemical processes known to the human soul. Your tears are not simple salt water, but the sacred solution that dissolves the artificial boundaries your conscious mind has erected between the known and the unknown, between the self you think you are and the self you are becoming. Each drop that falls carries within it the transformative power of what Jung called the transcendent function, that mysterious bridge between opposites that creates new consciousness from the tension of contradiction. Your willingness to feel fully, to let your emotional depths move through you without resistance, makes you an active participant in the ongoing creation of meaning itself, transforming raw experience into sacred understanding through the very act of conscious suffering. The tears you shed are not merely your own. They are the tears of the collective unconscious, the accumulated grief and joy of all humanity flowing through the particular vessel of your individual experience. When you cry not only for your personal losses but for the losses of all who have ever loved and lost, all who have ever hoped and been disappointed, all who have ever felt the terrible beauty of being human in a world that breaks hearts as readily as it fills them with wonder. This is why your tears feel so much larger than their immediate cause, why a seemingly small disappointment can open floodgates of sorrow that seem to encompass the entire world. You're not being dramatic or oversensitive. You are being permeable to the great emotional currents that flow through the collective psyche, allowing yourself to become a conscious vessel for the transformation of human suffering into human wisdom. The transcendent function operates through the principle of enantiodromia, the tendency of any extreme to generate its opposite. Your deepest grief contains within it the seeds of your greatest joy. Your most profound despair carries hidden within it the possibility of unexpected renewal. Your tears wash away not only what has been lost, but also the limited ways of seeing that prevented you from recognizing what was always present, but invisible to your former understanding. In the mystery of your weeping, the artificial separation between conscious and unconscious begins to dissolve. The rigid ego boundaries that normally define where you end and the world begins become permeable membranes through which deeper truths can flow. Your tears create a sacred space where the usual rules of logic and causality are suspended, where healing can occur through processes that the rational mind cannot comprehend, but the soul recognizes as utterly familiar. This is not the breakdown of consciousness, but its expansion, not the failure of your psychological defenses, but their conscious relaxation in service of a deeper integration. Your tears become the medium through which previously unconscious contents can emerge into awareness, not as overwhelming chaos, but as meaningful communication from the depths of your being. The alchemical tradition understood tears as one of the most powerful solvents in the work of transformation. They dissolve the false solidities that prevent new growth, create the receptive conditions necessary for genuine change, and prepare the ground for the emergence of what was always possible, but never before actual. Your emotional depths serve not as obstacles to growth, but as the very medium through which growth becomes possible. When you allow yourself to feel fully, you participate in what Jung called the ongoing creation of meaning, the continuous process through which the unconscious contents of the psyche are brought into conscious relationship and integrated into a more complete understanding of self and world. Your tears become prayer, your grief becomes wisdom, your openness to emotional truth becomes a gift to the collective evolution of human consciousness. This is why the attempt to transcend or bypass your emotional nature is not spiritual advancement, but spiritual avoidance. The path to wholeness does not lead around your feelings but through them, not over your emotional depths but into them. Your capacity for deep feeling is not a sign of spiritual immaturity, but of spiritual courage, not evidence of psychological weakness, but of psychological authenticity. The transcendent function reveals that your emotional intensity serves a purpose far greater than personal catharsis. Through your willingness to feel deeply, you participate in the great work of psychological and spiritual evolution, the ongoing transformation of human consciousness that occurs one individual at a time, one moment of authentic feeling at a time, one sacred tear at a time. Your tears bridge the gap between the personal and the transpersonal, between your individual experience and the universal patterns that give it meaning. They connect you to the eternal human story of loss and renewal, of dying and being reborn, of finding meaning in the midst of apparent meaninglessness. Through your emotional depths, you touch the archetypal dimension of existence where all human experiences reveal their underlying unity. The sacred function of your tears is not to solve your problems or eliminate your suffering, but to transform your relationship to both. They wash away the illusion that you must face life's challenges alone, revealing instead your deep interconnection with all of existence. They dissolve the false belief that your pain is pointless, showing you instead how your suffering can become a source of compassion and wisdom that serves not only your own healing, but the healing of the world. In the depths of your weeping, you discover that you are not a separate individual struggling alone against an indifferent universe, but a conscious participant in the great mystery of existence itself. Your tears become offerings on the altar of transformation. Your grief becomes a form of prayer. Your willingness to feel deeply becomes a sacred service to the ongoing evolution of consciousness. Through the transcendent function of your sacred tears, you learn that the goal of psychological and spiritual development is not the elimination of suffering, but the transformation of suffering into wisdom, not the avoidance of emotional pain, but the alchemical conversion of that pain into the gold of genuine understanding. Your emotional depth become not a cross to bear, but a gift to treasure, not a burden to overcome, but a sacred trust to honor. This is the mystery of the transcendent function, that through your willingness to feel fully, to weep when weeping is needed, to let your emotional depths move through you without resistance, you become a conscious agent of transformation not only for yourself, but for the collective human soul. Your tears water the garden of consciousness. Your grief fertilizes the soil of wisdom. Your emotional courage serves the greater work of human healing and evolution. There comes a moment in every deep soul's journey when you recognize yourself as the archetypal fool, not the simpleton of common understanding, but the sacred fool of ancient wisdom traditions, the one who stumbles into truth precisely because you have never learned to avoid the dangerous territories where truth actually lives. Your sensitive nature has been your compass through landscapes that more cautious minds circle from a safe distance, never daring to enter the wild country where real wisdom grows. You have walked the path that logical minds dismiss as foolishness, the path that leads directly through the heart of feeling, through the swamplands of emotion, through the dark forests of uncertainty, where the ego's maps prove useless, and only the soul's deeper knowing can serve as guide. Where others built walls against the overwhelming nature of existence, you remained porous. Where others armored themselves with cynicism and detachment, you stayed tender. Where others chose the safety of numbness, you chose the courage of feeling. And, now, like the fool returning from his quest in the ancient tales, you carried treasures that cannot be purchased, wisdom that cannot be taught, understanding that can only be earned through the willingness to be wounded by life and to let those wounds become doorways rather than closed doors. Your journey through the landscape of deep feeling has initiated you into mysteries that no university can teach, truths that no book can fully contain, wisdom that emerges only from the direct encounter with the raw reality of human existence. The fool's journey is always circular. You leave home innocent and return home wise, but the home you return to is transformed by the consciousness you have gained through your wandering. You began your journey believing that your sensitivity was a flaw to be corrected, a weakness to be overcome, a curse to be endured. You return with the hard-won knowledge that your ability to feel deeply is not a burden but a gift, not a liability but your greatest strength, not a sign of failure, but evidence of your soul's refusal to accept anything less than full participation in the mystery of being human. The wounds you have carried, the places where life broke you open, where disappointment carved you hollow, where loss left you gasping. These are not scars to be hidden, but sacred markings that identify you as one who has traveled to the depths and returned with authentic wisdom. Your wounds have become your credentials, your scars, your qualifications, your willingness to be broken open, your greatest accomplishment. In the tradition of the wounded healer, you discover that your capacity to help others stems not from your strength, but from your willingness to be weak, not from your success, but from your failures, not from your ability to avoid pain, but from your courage to feel it fully and let it transform you. Your sensitivity becomes the very instrument through which you can touch the sensitive places in others. Your emotional depth, the well from which you can draw understanding for those who are drowning in their own feelings. The wise fool knows that the goal was never to become invulnerable, but to become genuinely vulnerable. To develop the capacity to be hurt without becoming bitter, to be disappointed without becoming cynical, to be broken without becoming hardened. You have learned the paradoxical truth that real strength comes not from building walls, but from developing the ability to remain open even when openness brings pain. Your journey has taught you that the attempt to protect yourself from feeling deeply is also the attempt to protect yourself from living fully. The same sensitivity that makes you vulnerable to pain also makes you available to beauty, to wonder, to the subtle currents of meaning that flow beneath the surface of ordinary experience. You cannot close yourself to one without closing yourself to the other. This is the price and the gift of a sensitive soul. The fool's wisdom is always paradoxical wisdom, the knowledge that not knowing is sometimes deeper than knowing, that weakness can be a form of strength, that the willingness to appear foolish in the eyes of the world is sometimes the most courageous stance you can take. Your sensitivity has made you a fool in the eyes of those who mistake hardness for strength, but it has also made you wise in ways that transcend ordinary cleverness. As you return home to yourself, you carry the treasure of self-acceptance, the profound recognition that you are not broken but beautifully, necessarily sensitive. not flawed, but finely tuned to frequencies that others cannot hear. Your emotional depths are not a design flaw, but a divine gift, not a personal failing, but a sacred calling to serve as a bridge between the worlds of feeling and meaning. The wise fool's journey is ultimately a journey of integration, the return to wholeness that comes not through rejecting your sensitive nature, but through embracing it fully, not through transcending your emotional depths, but through diving deeper into them and discovering the treasures hidden in their darkness. You learn to carry your sensitivity not as a burden, but as a blessing, not as a weakness, but as a superpower that allows you to navigate the subtle dimensions of human experience with unprecedented grace. Your homecoming is not a return to innocence, but an arrival at wisdom, the wisdom that comes from having faced the full spectrum of human experience and found ways to remain open-hearted through it all. You have learned that the goal is not to avoid being affected by life, but to be affected consciously, not to eliminate your emotional responses, but to develop the capacity to feel deeply without being destroyed by what you feel. In the end, the wise fool's journey reveals that your sensitivity was never the problem. It was always the solution. Your capacity for deep feeling was never your weakness. It was always your strength. Your emotional intensity was never your curse. It was always your gift. The journey home is the journey to this recognition, this acceptance, this celebration of the very qualities that once seemed to set you apart from the world, but now reveal themselves as the very qualities that connect you most deeply to the heart of existence itself. You return home not as the naive fool who left, but as the wise fool who has learned that feeling deeply is not a mistake, but a mastery, not a failure, but a triumph, not a weakness, but the greatest strength a human soul can possess. In the mythology of your own becoming, you have unknowingly embodied one of the most sacred archetypes known to the human psyche, the wounded healer, the one who transforms personal suffering into transpersonal service, who alchemizes private pain into universal medicine. Like Chiron, the wise centaur of Greek mythology, who was accidentally wounded by one of Heracles' poisoned arrows and could heal all others but never himself, you have discovered that your deepest wounds have become your most profound qualifications for touching the wounded places in others. Your scars are not disfigurements but sacred sites where the membrane between worlds has grown thin, where the ordinary boundaries between self and other become permeable, where your personal experience of pain creates a doorway through which healing can flow, not just for yourself, but for all who recognize their own broken places in the geography of your suffering. Each wound you have carried has been an initiation, each moment of brokenness a deepening of your capacity to hold space for the brokenness of others. The authority with which you can speak to pain comes not from academic study or theoretical understanding, but from the lived experience of having been shattered and having learned to live beautifully with the cracks. Your sensitivity, which once seemed like a liability, reveals itself as your greatest credential, the evidence that you have traveled to the places where real healing is needed, that you have dwelt in the darkness where others fear to venture, that you have learned to find light, not by avoiding the shadows, but by learning to see with shadow-adapted eyes. This is the paradox of the wounded healer. Your qualification to heal others emerges precisely from your inability to heal yourself completely. The wound that never fully closes becomes the permanent opening through which compassion flows. The pain that never entirely disappears becomes the eternal source of your capacity to recognize and respond to pain in others. Your ongoing relationship with your own vulnerability becomes the foundation of your ability to create safety for others' vulnerability. Like Chiron, you have discovered that the wound and the gift are inseparable, that your capacity to heal flows directly from your willingness to remain in conscious relationship with your own woundedness. You do not heal others by transcending your pain, but by transforming it, not by overcoming your sensitivity, but by learning to use it as a precision instrument for touching the tender places where healing is most needed. Your emotional journey has taught you languages that cannot be learned in schools, the language of grief that speaks to grieving hearts, the language of fear that comforts frightened souls, the language of loneliness that reaches those who feel most isolated. You have become fluent in the dialects of despair and hope, conversant in the grammar of breaking and mending, skilled in the translation between the country of pain and the country of meaning. When others encounter you, they sense immediately that you are not speaking from theory, but from lived experience, not from a place of having avoided life's difficulties, but from a place of having been initiated by them. Your presence carries the unmistakable authority of one who has been to the depths and returned with hard-won wisdom, who has been broken open and learned to live with an expanded heart rather than a defended one. The wounded healer's path is not about fixing others or even fixing yourself. It is about becoming a living bridge between the world of wounds and the world of healing, between the experience of being broken and the possibility of being whole, between the reality of pain and the reality of meaning. You learn to hold space for both simultaneously, to be present to suffering without being overwhelmed by it, to offer healing without claiming to have all the answers. Your dark nights of the soul become the very experiences that qualify you to guide others through their own passages of darkness. The times when you felt most lost become the maps you can offer to those who are currently losing their way. The moments when you felt most alone become the basis for your ability to provide genuine companionship to others in their solitude. This is the sacred alchemy of the wounded healer. Your personal wounds become transpersonal medicine. Your individual suffering becomes universal healing. Your private pain becomes public service. Not through denying or transcending your wounds, but through accepting them so completely that they become doorways rather than walls, bridges rather than barriers, gifts rather than burdens. The calling of the wounded healer is not something you choose, but something that chooses you. It emerges naturally from your willingness to let your wounds become sacred, rather than simply painful, meaningful rather than merely traumatic, transformative rather than merely destructive. You become a healer, not by eliminating your sensitivity, but by learning to use it consciously. Not by overcoming your emotional intensity, but by channeling it purposefully. Your healing presence is not based on your perfection, but on your willingness to be imperfect authentically, not on your strength, but on your willingness to be weak courageously, not on your answers, but on your willingness to live beautifully within the questions. You offer healing not by having transcended the human condition, but by having learned to inhabit it fully, not by having solved the mystery of suffering, but by having learned to dance with it gracefully. In the end, the wounded healer discovers that the wound is not something to be healed, but something to be honored, not something to be eliminated, but something to be integrated, not something to be ashamed of, but something to be grateful for. Your wounds become your credentials, your scars, your qualifications, your sensitivity, your greatest tool for serving the healing of a world that desperately needs those who understand pain from the inside. The wounded healer's calling is ultimately the calling to transform suffering into service, wounds into wisdom, pain into purpose. Through your willingness to remain vulnerable, to stay sensitive, to keep your heart open even when it hurts, you become a living testament to the possibility that our deepest wounds can become our greatest gifts, that our most painful experiences can become our most powerful medicine, that our sensitivity can become our strength.